All right, it's Mrs. Firth back again to talk to you about the basic historical context of medieval England behind Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. When you think of the medieval period, you probably think about knights in shining armor and damsels in distress and castles and moats and drawbridges and dragons and such, and you're thinking the right time. But there's a lot more to it than just what you saw in Shrek, although Shrek's not entirely far off. The first thing you need to know is that we mark the beginning of the medieval period with 1066, which was also the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. And it was a really big year for historians and linguists alike, which hopefully I'll help you understand why by the end of this presentation. What happened in 1066 was that William the Conqueror invaded England and successfully took it over, or conquered it, which is why they call him the Conqueror. He was the Duke of Normandy, and he was the French illegitimate son of a cousin of the dead English king, Edward the Confessor. And he believed himself to be the heir to the king's throne because he felt this was an agreement that he and Edward had come to. And he felt that this other guy, Harold, knew this to be true, and that they had come to an agreement about it some years prior when Harold had come to William in France to get weapons and support in fighting the Danes. At this point in time, England was more under Dane law, meaning it was more run by the Vikings than it was the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons had been dominated and compacted into one small area in the southeast corner of England, and everything else was more or less run by the Vikings, by the Danes. But by this point, the five great kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England were over. There was just the one, and there was just the one Anglo-Saxon king, Edward. Edward had no sons, and William had been named as his successor, so William thought it was on for him when Edward died. But when Edward died, this guy Harold, who had been like Edward's right-hand man, sent William a letter and was like, sorry, psych, I'm in charge now, I'm the new king. And William said, that's what you think. And so William invaded England in 1066 and successfully dominated the Anglo-Saxons and drove them back. And then he made deals with the Danish. He paid them off, more or less, to get them to leave. And there were a number of rebellions and skirmishes, but ultimately, through basically terrorist tactics, he was able to bring the entire country of England into submission. And the Celts, well, they just kept living in Scotland and Wales and more or less minding their business at this point. And so England was left to the control of the Normans. And the Normans went on to completely change England, like the way that Ty Pennington used to redecorate an Extreme Home Makeover. The first step in that makeover was always tearing down the house completely, and that's what William the Conqueror did. It's also worth noting that William the Conqueror was a descendant of Vikings, Rollo in particular, who was the brother of Ragnar Lothbrok. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Moving on. There is a tapestry called the Bayeux Tapestry in France that was embroidered by a bunch of nuns that tells the whole story of how William the Conqueror sailed into England and took over. I'm going to play that YouTube video for you, or I would play it for you in this video, but YouTube doesn't like that type of thing. So you're going to need to see the link below in the description box and click there to see the animated video of the Bayeux Tapestry so you can see the whole story and how we know, well, one of the ways that we know what happened when William the Conqueror invaded. Now let's talk about the changes that the Normans put into effect once they took over. Well, they organized England in a way that it had not really been organized before. It was like the equivalent of a federal government coming in and setting up a governmental structure. One thing that still happens for us today that we owe to the Normans is property taxes. The Domesday Book was one of the Norman innovations, and they went around and interviewed every landowner. And in the Domesday Book, they cataloged every single thing that wealthy landowners owned, down to the peasants for whom they were responsible. And then they charged them property taxes based on what their ownership was. And those property taxes went on up the feudal pyramid scheme, and I'll talk to you about that in just a moment. And that's how they funded the government. And it was a very different structure than the Anglo-Saxon quasi-socialist tax base. Not that there was really exactly a tax base, but you know what I mean. But one of the things that makes it most important to the linguists is that usually, as we've seen in other places in the world, when a conqueror comes in, the conquered people are forced to learn the language of the conquerors. And that didn't quite happen in England. The French that the Normans spoke, which was Old French, mixed with Old English, and there was some Latin mixed in too, as well, with the influence from the Catholic Church. And all of that came together and became Middle English, which is markedly different from Old English, and we'll be examining that later in the week. But if William the Conqueror had been a bigger jerk, and he was a pretty big jerk, we would all be speaking French right now in our American classroom, because England would be a French-speaking country. But instead, English evolved to incorporate the three major groups of people in English society, and it ultimately made a language that worked best for everyone, even though there was resistance amongst the different language-speaking groups at first to adopting this combined language. The three estates, or the three social classes at the time, were the clergy, the nobles, and the commoners. Supposedly the clergy was the highest, although they didn't have the same amount of power as the nobility, but they considered themselves to be the highest because, they worked for God, of course, and they were considered those who pray, and they spoke Latin chiefly. And the clergy were the most well-educated, and to this day, being able to speak Latin is supposed to be a marker of how well you've been educated. And their purpose was to save everyone's soul. And I'm going to guess that the clergy, everyone who was employed in support of the church, that probably made up about 10% of society. And then there were the nobility, the nobles. And those were the ones who came from France, because, of course, William the Conqueror only appointed his French brethren to have noble titles. And they were considered to be those who fight. They were important because they formed the government and protected the country. And they allowed for everyone to work in peace, and they provided justice, in theory. And they only spoke French. If they were super educated, they also spoke Latin, but that was a very small percentage of the population. And then most people were commoners. You and I would have most certainly been commoners. And that made up about 87, 88% of the population. And our purpose was to work. And we worked to support the clergy and the nobility. That was our entire purpose. To dig the ditches, to feed the cows, to empty the slop buckets, to knit the wool, all of that. That was what you and I existed to do. And we would have spoken English at this time. And we would only know French if we worked directly for the nobility in the homes of the nobility, and we wouldn't know Latin at all, even though we might attend church services that were delivered entirely in Latin. And we certainly wouldn't have been able to read any English. We would only have been able to speak it. Okay, so the other thing that the Normans did was introduce feudalism into England as the governmental structure that lasted for a good long time. This is not an actual chart of a particular feudal family tree. It's just an example of how this pyramid scheme might work. As my tagline says, feudalism, it worked, but not well. There were some flaws. Essentially, it was a pyramid scheme. And in order to make everybody down at the bottom, and by the way, you and I are so far down at the bottom, we're not even on this pyramid. To make everybody at the bottom accept that this pyramid was good and right, we all had to believe that God was at the top of the pyramid and that God chose the king to rule us all. Then the king would have barons and dukes who were very closely connected to him, usually relatives of some kind, brothers-in-law, uncles, cousins, etc. That would be barons, who would also then have people under them, dukes, lords, and then local lords would be responsible for providing knights in the king's service whenever the king would call for any kind of military backup. And essentially, the commoners down here who aren't even on this chart, as I said, we would be earning money and paying up to our lord. And our lord would be paying up to some duke, and that duke would be paying up to some baron, and that baron would be paying up to the king. The king would be getting, to borrow a phrase, the king's ransom of the income in the country. The tax burden would have been great, is what I mean by that. The problem, as it turned out, which we'll find at the end of the medieval period with Henry VIII, is that if God is at the top of the pyramid, then who is in charge on earth? The king or the pope? And once again brings the question, who's the higher ranking social class, the clergy or the nobility? And the peasants didn't get a vote, frankly, but it was something for the clergy and the nobility to fight out between themselves. And as you see with Henry VIII and his struggle with the Catholic Church, it ultimately led to a great deal of heartache and misery for millions of people. But in order for the commoners to accept the monetary structure of their government, they had to believe that God was at the top and that God wanted people to be in the positions they were in. And that if you were poor and common and had no teeth and your whole job was, scooping pig poop up all day, you had to believe that that is what God wanted you to do while the king had someone feed him grapes and polish his toenails. And if people at the bottom stopped believing that, then feudalism would fold, which was another reason why the king had to do a very hesitant dance of power with the Catholic Church, because belief in God and also fear of God was important for him to maintain his power. But he didn't want to share as much of that power as the Catholic Church eventually expected him to share, and thus led to the end of the medieval period, among other things, but we'll talk about that in a moment. During the medieval period, women were property, and they worked like dogs. It wasn't great to be a woman in the Anglo-Saxon period, as you could see from the family trees that we looked at in Beowulf. Most of the women weren't even named, so it wasn't like they were important enough to be recorded in history. But they could do things like own property, they could fight. It was against the law to commit acts of domestic abuse. So there was that side for women in the Anglo-Saxon period. That was over once the Normans came in. I'm not sure what led to the difference between Viking and Anglo-Saxon ideas about gender and Norman ideas about gender, particularly considering that the Normans were descendants of the Vikings. But it was certainly different. Women were property, and they worked like dogs, especially if they were common women, in which case they were not allowed to own property. They were property. They could not inherit property. Only their male relatives could inherit property. And if they were left anything, it would have to go to a male relative who would look after it for them and tell them what they could and could not have. The impact of that carried on through as early as, as late as the 1960s. I remember my own mother having a Riches credit card. You guys might not know what Riches was, but it was the department store in Atlanta that Macy's used to be. Macy's bought out Riches. But my mother had a Riches credit card that was in her husband's name from the late 60s because women couldn't have their own credit cards. When my mother was in her 20s, women could not buy their own cars. They couldn't take out loans. They had to have a man who was willing to go with them to take all that on. And that was just not that long ago in the big scheme of things. And we have the Normans to thank for that. Thanks, Normans. Anyway, however, there were some weird ideas about women tied up with chivalry. Knights at this time, another expectation that we had about masculinity, was that men, particularly knights, were supposed to behave like Boy Scouts on steroids. They were all about loyalty and honor and codes, and we'll talk about that on the next page. But during this time period, so much was tied up in the value of a woman in relation to her sexual past that this concept of courtly love sprung up. You had many situations amongst noble families where very young girls were married off to fairly old men. Men didn't really have much reason to get married except to produce legitimate heirs to their homes. And so, a lot of times a young girl's ideas about romance did not go hand in hand with a much older man's. And so you had young girls who needed distractions, who bothered their husbands, and could easily get crushes on the handsome knights about the castles. And so it became the trend that married women would have completely platonic relationships with these knights that were romantic on the outside. There was a lot of, poem writing and ribbon exchanging and lute playing, but all in the show of love. It wasn't real love. No sex was ever supposed to happen. Not ever. It was never supposed to be physical, because the reason why men wanted to get married was because that way they could ensure that their offspring was theirs and not someone else's. Now, of course, this didn't always work, but that was the idea. What reason would you have to get married otherwise? The story of King Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere is an example of, it's a cautionary tale of what could happen if courtly love got out of control and it became physical, which is what happened with Lancelot and Guinevere. Guinevere was King Arthur's wife, and then Lancelot was King Arthur's, number one knight. But he and Guinevere fell in love through this process of courtly love, and it became physical, and, one thing led to another, and that was the end of Camelot. So the stories of Camelot and King Arthur and Merlin and all of that led ultimately to be a cautionary tale to young women about the dangers of getting sexually involved with anyone who was not their husband. Because if they did that, then the parentage of offspring could not be controlled. So it was important that women were afraid of the consequences of sexual behavior. Okay, now more about this chivalry business. This, by the way, is a medieval painting of the King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. you can always tell medieval art because they don't really use perspective in the way that we expect. Some people say that they did understand perspective, they just didn't like it. Other people say, nope, that was an innovation of the Renaissance, was to understand how to draw and paint using perspective. But here you can see that very often in medieval art, people are all the wrong sizes, but it also has, symbolic significance. Here, these tiny men are the servants, and the largest men in the painting are the ones who are the most important, including King Arthur here on the far left. I guess this is Merlin. I'm not sure. Merlin. Anyway, okay. So, chivalry is a product of feudalism, and it's an idealized system of manners and morals that, please note, was restricted to nobility. The farmers in the fields were not caught up with having to make, oaths of chivalry every day. They just had to, feed the pigs. Now, the medieval knight was bound to chivalric code to be loyal to God first, his lord second, and his lady third. And you were supposed to be benevolent at all times and exercise brotherly love and be polite all the time. Sir Gawain is an example of this. Sir Gawain the Green Knight, that's in your textbook if you'd like to read it. We're not going to read it as a class. But basically, a knight was supposed to be the Christian ideal. He was supposed to behave more or less like Jesus, but he was also supposed to have a fake romantic interest in someone else's wife. If that seems really messed up to you, well, it should seem really messed up to you. It is really messed up. One of the tropes of chivalry is, when a lady might step across a mud puddle, a knight is supposed to whip off his cloak and lay it across the mud puddle so the lady does not soil her shoe. But, okay, this is so problematic. First, why couldn't the woman walk around the mud puddle? She's not made of sugar. She's not going to dissolve. Women are not that fragile. Why couldn't he pick her up and carry her across the mud puddle if it was so big that she couldn't walk around it? Because you have this woman being treated like she is some sort of fragile toddler made of cotton candy who's going to dissolve and die if her every need is not taken care of. And then meanwhile, his cloak is ruined. Why does the man have to suffer and be cold and wet and covered in mud because this woman couldn't walk around it and he couldn't carry her across it? I mean, this is just one particular example of the kind of chivalry that knights were supposed to show, but it shoved both roles into tight boxes here about how they could and could not behave. And ultimately, I'm not sure that it was really healthy for anybody. So when people say, oh no, chivalry is dead, I'm like, well, I think maybe it ought to be. It's not entirely healthy for everybody. I don't mind getting help crossing the puddle when I need it, but give me a shot to walk around it. Maybe. And you keep your cloak. You should be warm. I should be warm. Let's keep the rain off. We'll both be happier people. And we'll be nicer to each other if we're both dry and, able to use our own agency to make decisions about how to cross mud puddles. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox now and move on to chatting about the Crusades, which is something that you need to know was happening in the Middle Ages. From 1095 to 1270, practically every European knight, and all European knights were Christian, that's like the rule, they were engaged in a series of holy wars against the Holy Land. This was because Pope Urban II believed that the Muslims who were occupying Jerusalem and other, quote, holy places in the Middle East needed to be purged. Now, at first he called for an outright genocide. Like, he wanted all the knights in Christendom to, load up their horses and ride into the Holy Land and kill everyone who was not Christian. who was in the way. Um, More so Muslims than Jews, but they wouldn't have hesitated to kill a Jewish person if they had the opportunity. And as you might imagine, outrageous and enormous carnage followed. But look how long, the Crusades went on. It was nearly 200 years that the Crusades went on and on and on and on and on, and they weren't successful, as you probably pieced together by now. Um, Much to Pope Urban II's surprise, the people occupying the Holy Land didn't say, "Oh, well, now the true people have come to save us from this, and we're just going to lie down and die and let them have it." It didn't work that way. Obviously, both Muslims and Jews felt that they had just as much right to occupy the quote Holy Land end quote as anyone else, and maybe more so, and they did not just give up and allow themselves to be slaughtered. And so ultimately the Pope decided, okay, well, we can just convert everyone in Christendom. Sorry, not in Christendom. We can convert everyone in the Holy Land to Christianity, and then it will be, okay. And quelle surprise, that was also not a viable plan. And ultimately, they did give up. And furthermore, the Catholic Church now is real sorry about all this. Like, it was not cool. And they know that, and they're real sorry. But you have to understand that during this time period, we were probably lucky if 10% of society was literate. 10%. And it's really difficult to be a critically thinking human being without being exposed to bigger ideas than the ones outside of your own head. And it's really hard to be exposed to bigger ideas if you can't read. And in a way, that meant that 90% of the population was incredibly vulnerable to manipulation. And nowhere is that more obvious than the Children's Crusade of 1212, which modern historians say, actually, the Children's Crusade was probably actually two different events, one that took place in France and one that took place in Germany, and probably not exactly as the legend went. But here's what the legend says. The legend says that there was this kid, and this is in France, but there was a very similar incident in Germany. Anyway, this kid believed that he had a letter from Jesus that he himself needed to deliver to the king. And the letter from Jesus said that all of the children were to go to the Middle East, and because they were all innocent children, they would be able to magically convert everyone in the Middle East to Christianity, and that would end the Crusades. And this kid went from town to town, village to village, and recruited, in some cases, or in some historical accounts, 30,000 people, both children and adults alike, more so children, from town to town, and to get them wrapped up in this crusade. And then ultimately, all these people disappeared and were never heard from again. And there is no suggestion that they ever reached the Holy Land. Now, there are a couple of things that could have happened. One is that they just kind of gave up halfway through and just kind of dissolved into society where they were and never returned home because it was too far and they were too poor and they didn't know where home was anymore. That's possible. There's also another theory that they were betrayed by the few adults who were in the group and the children were sold into slavery. That is certainly one possibility. But as I've said, there were two different movements that were very near at the same time, one in Germany, one in France. And so it seems as if perhaps someone was organizing these things and encouraging people to believe this idea, I've got a letter from Jesus. And who knows what this kid actually had. None of them could read. He could have had, some monk's grocery list. They wouldn't have known. They just knew that reading was possible and that it was something to do with marks on a piece of paper. And a lot of people were eager to believe it. They believed that they would walk to the coast and the sea would open and split for them and they could walk to the Holy Land, which obviously didn't happen. And, it's tragic. And one of the ways that we can see the ongoing effect of these children's crusades on the mind of the cultures in France and Germany is the ongoing story of the Pied Piper, which became one of the Grimm brothers fairy tales that were collected in the 19th century. And obviously that story harkens back to this idea of someone who would come to town and collect all the children, and the children would never be seen again. And, the Children's Crusade was in 1212, and the Grimm brothers were collecting these fairy tales, the folk tales in the 19th century. So that's 600 years that this tale persisted, carried on through oral tradition, because it was such a haunting thing that had occurred and scarred the minds of everyone in Western Europe. Anyway, so the Crusades were going on. We'll see them mentioned in the Canterbury Tales, and I wanted you to know some background about what that was. The other guy you need to know about is Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Canterbury, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, was the hand of the Pope in England. He was the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church in the country of England. And so he thought, probably more often than not, that he had more authority than the king, King Henry II. And King Henry II, of course, believed that he had more authority than Thomas Becket. And they clashed fairly often, which, was par for the course in English history. But Becket made Henry II mad because Becket would not let the church be controlled by the nobility. And then supposedly King Henry II, accidentally on purpose questioned in front of his court if there was anyone who might rid him of that meddlesome priest, meaning Becket, and he said so in front of his knights. And the knights, following the codes of chivalry, believing that they had to, do whatever their king wanted, immediately got on their horses and rode to Canterbury Cathedral, and they murdered Becket as he said his evening prayers in the sanctuary of the cathedral, at the altar. And it was apparently a very brutal murder. Lots and lots and lots of blood. They bashed his head in. There were brains everywhere. And this was shocking to the public. Utterly shocking. First of all, it's called a sanctuary because nothing violent's ever supposed to happen there. Secondly, the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the hand of the Catholic Church in England, was unthinkable, and that it had been done by knights who were supposed to be following the code of chivalry and only doing, Boy Scouty type things all the time. This crime layered shock upon shock upon shock. And so it was a huge sensationalistic story amongst the people of Europe at the time. And Pope Alexander made no, what's what I'm looking for? Pope Alexander did not let much time pass before he made Becket a saint. I believe he made Becket a saint within 3 days of his murder. Like, as soon as he heard about it, he made Becket a saint because Becket had been martyred for the cause of the Catholic Church. And then they built a shrine for Becket there at the cathedral, which became very popular amongst medieval travelers. And that's what the people in the Canterbury Tales are doing. It's pilgrims who are going to Canterbury to visit the shrine of Thomas Becket because they believed that, that was a good place to go pray and be forgiven of their sins. But it's also such a huge tourist attraction that it made Canterbury basically like the Panama City of the English spring break. That's where everybody wanted to go. It has a festival-like atmosphere that sprung up around the cathedral. You could go there to see the shrine, but you could also go for, jousting tournaments and, cockfighting and bear baiting and fortune telling and, all kinds of unsavory activities, plus, turkey legs and whatnot. A great big medieval fare. But ultimately, King Henry VIII destroyed the shrine, which, is no surprise since these political events so closely mirrored his own struggles with the Catholic Church much later in the 16th century. Okay, so that's Canterbury Cathedral from the exterior. It is still there. You can go and visit it. It is a stunning piece of architecture, packed to the gills with plenty of dead people who are most important in English history for the past 1,000 years. This cathedral is 1,000 years old, which is stunning considering its Gothic architecture and how well it's been maintained. Okay, so the end of the medieval period came about for 3 reasons. First, there was the 100 Years' War, which was actually 112 years, but it was England versus France, and it ultimately changed knighthood. They realized that just raising a bunch of individual knights was not the best way to put an army together. It was a bunch of guys who felt that they were all in charge, and they didn't have enough grunts. They didn't have enough soldiers who were, willing to take orders and fight in the front lines. You had big groups of dudes who had been trained separately in different locations who weren't working as a cohesive unit. And so they had to bring in, a more modern approach to the military, which necessarily meant that, the peasants would have to be trained to become soldiers, and they would earn a living being a soldier, which helped rise the middle class and ultimately helped dissolve part of the reason why feudalism worked, and that was because that was how they had built their military, but that changed. Then the Black Death came along, which was spread by fleas, hence the clip art on this page, and it's totally gross. And we're going to watch a video, which I'm also going to link in the description box below, about the Black Death and how it restructured the economy of Europe during the Middle Ages, and also what the Black Death was. And it's really very interesting little video, which you'll see in just a moment. And also the rise of the middle class came. And when the middle class came, you didn't have people who were so willing to be serfs anymore. And there were plenty of people who had just as much money as some of the lower ranking nobility. And so some of the lines got very, very blurry. And ultimately, I marked the end of the medieval period with the death of Henry VIII. And there are a few years there in the middle. But then ultimately, Elizabeth I, her reign marks the beginning of the Renaissance period, at least in England, the English Renaissance, which is where we'll pick up for our next unit. All right, well, that's all I have to say about the medieval period today. Please watch both the videos that are linked in the description box below. And I hope you're going to be ready for the Canterbury Tales. Thanks, guys.